All right. Well, thank you. I'll start my piece, and just a couple preliminary comments. So in Marika's project, she's talking about a lot of different things, but if we start with the question of megafires and the fire intensity in Bolivia and elsewhere in the world, what we're looking at are what are arguably is wider impacts of climate change. What the anthropologist Ethan Smith has recently talked about is global burning as opposed to global warming. And so my project is in a way connected with the project, and not just because it's located in Bolivia, of Marika, because what I'm doing is focusing on a form of extraction that is at the beginning of one key response to climate change, which is the extraction of lithium and its processing into compounds that are used to manufacture lithium-ion batteries. So we've been conducting research at different scales in Bolivia and beyond, and I can introduce so David Schroeder, who is the PhD student on the project. He's involved in this project as well, so I wanted to make sure to acknowledge his presence. But what I want to do in my 20, 25, 30 minutes is talk about a few parts of this. So I'm going to start by describing the political economic context in which lithium extraction in Bolivia is relevant. Then I'll move, as the title suggests, to talk about what we might call the granular materialities shape and define lithium extraction in Bolivia. Then I'm going to move on to a third category, which are local projects of what we're calling auto development that are taking place in the same region that lithium extraction takes place and are connected to the state lithium project in one way or another. What I'll talk about is in the penumbra of lithium industrialization. And then I'll conclude my piece by introducing competing visions or competing projects to the state lithium project in Bolivia. Competing visions which are also very local in the area in which we're conducting research, and which, in a sense, reveal interesting complexities, which I think, as we'll talk about later, ethnography is uniquely situated, or particularly situated to reveal. And as you can see, I have a book, not a paper. So I have my notes. So my piece is going to be much less elegant and much less coherent than Marika's piece. But I will say that as Marika, I am also going to be writing a book based on this research during a sabbatical year in 12 months next year. So I'm very much thinking of this already in terms of how it's going to come together as a book. And so I very much appreciate your comments as I help to think about the analysis of the structure. So first, let me start with the political economic context. So the first thing to say is that, as you might know, there is an explosive demand for lithium in the world. And this is related to what you see in the graph here, which is this exponential explosive demand in certain kinds of mobility, primarily cars and commercial trucks, which themselves are being powered by lithium-ion batteries. And lithium-ion batteries are constructed by a range of very interesting materials, which have their own assemblages and are embedded in their own histories of violence and extraction, such as cobalt and nickel and so on. What we're focusing on is arguably the most important constituent of a lithium-ion battery, which is lithium, which is used in different parts of the battery. I won't go into the sort of nerdy discussion of lithium-ion battery chemistry, but that's something which we're having to sort of muddle our way through. But I can talk a little bit about that if there's anybody here who's interested in what makes lithium so unique in terms of mobility and production of energy. And another thing about this graph, if you see, we start in 2015, and what you see here is not only is there this exponential explosion in lithium-ion battery, but you see the ratio and the kinds of uses that are being put to lithium-ion batteries. So what you have is, as you get farther to the right, you see that passenger vehicles and commercial EVs are taking up a higher percentage of the use of lithium-ion batteries, with an interesting percentage taken up by storage, which is something I can talk about later. And so why is that? why do we see this change? Not only do we see this explosion in the demand, but also in the change in the ratio, and that is because, as many of you know, we're in the midst of a so-called green energy transition, which is being promoted and pushed at various levels: political, economic, and commercial. And for example, since we're here in Europe, well, we're in the continent of Europe and not in the European Union, here in Switzerland, the recently announced €1 trillion European Union Green Deal, which promises a carbon neutral climate by 2050. And it also has intermediate targets up until 2030 and 2035, all of which fundamentally depend upon the electrification of mobility, which therefore requires lithium-ion batteries, which therefore, according to current technology, which therefore require lithium. So with that as a kind of initial, and I can say more about that if you want, why Bolivia? Where does Bolivia fit into this story? So as it turns out, Bolivia, the territory that's covered by the modern nation state of Bolivia, has the world's largest reserves of lithium. And lithium is found all over the world. There's lithium in the oceans. Lithium is the world's lightest metal, an alkaline metal that turns out to be prevalent throughout nature in different ways, but it's only prevalent in sufficient enough concentrations to make it viable for extraction and use, in this case in batteries, in very few places around the world, which is one of the paradoxes. And it's found in hard rock, and mined and extracted in places like Australia and China through the rock, but it's also found in brine. And brine is a highly saline solution of water, which is also found in many parts of the world. But it just turns out that in this part, if you see the top right, you see South America, and then you see Bolivia. This is this part of the world, South America and the southern cone, where you have these large salares, which are evaporated lakes, and underneath the crust, as I'll show you in a minute, you have brine, the saline solution. It's basically a combination. It's basically water that is flowing through this incredibly complicated underground geology, and as it flows across this complicated geology, it leaches or extracts minerals into the water, and those minerals include magnesium, mostly sodium, but in this part of the world, also lithium. So you have the Salar de Uyuni, which is here, which is the world's largest evaporated lake, the world's largest salar. It's about, as it turns out, the same size as the country of Qatar. It's often misidentified as being in the literature as being the same size as Wales. It's actually smaller than Wales, but just to give you an idea, it's absolutely massive. 10,500 square square miles, and let's see, yeah. So the Salar de Uyuni, the world's largest salar, and it happens to have the world's largest confirmed deposit of lithium. So, as you see here on the right-hand side, and this is, I believe, The Economist. So I put a chart from The Economist magazine next to a photograph of the Salar de Uyuni. So you see basically the crust of the salar, which is comprised mostly of halite or rock salt, and the brine is underneath that. But the chart to the right in the classic economist language is describing the project of lithium in Bolivia as all potential, no action. I think that's the title. The title is propped off at the top. But anyway, the title of this is all potential, no action. And why? Because although Bolivia has by as you can see, around 21 million tons of lithium carbonate equivalent, it's barely begun to extract and produce lithium carbonate. So you see the top chart is the estimated resources of lithium carbonate, and at the bottom you have the annual production. And as you can see here, Bolivia, which is in the red, is barely visible at the bottom. As you move to the right, you can see that it's producing some lithium carbonate at a pilot level. So why does this matter? Why is this initial story, this initial discussion of the political economy matter. Because going back to that green energy transition, the so-called green energy transition will be impossible without Bolivian lithium. It's just absolutely impossible without accessing a considerable part of that 21 million tons that the demand for lithium-ion batteries can be even met by 10% or 15%. So while there's searches going on for other sources of lithium carbonate, it's really this 21 million tons, which is primarily locked still in the Salar de Uyuni, where all the global focus is increasingly. Because as you saw, although the Chileans are producing a lot of lithium, they're also depleting their lithium reserves. The same thing is happening in Argentina. So what does that mean? Again, just one final point about the political economics. So you have an exponential demand for lithium, which means that the price per ton of lithium carbonate has also spiked dramatically, even since 2019. In 2019, when I first started the project, the price per ton was around $5,000 per ton. Now it's between $70,000 and $80,000 per ton. It's an absolutely explosive demand because of the fact that the supply is so limited in relation to the demand. So you have a massive rise in price per ton, which means that the price to manufacture lithium-ion batteries has also spiked, which keeps the price of electric vehicles high. So the price of the EVs is largely, not exclusively, but largely dependent on the price of the massive battery banks, which means that it makes it less likely that people will adopt EVs if the price of EVs continue to be high because of the problem with supply, which brings us all the way back to Bolivia. So we're starting as a sort of principle with this notion of all potential, no action, and studying ethnographically these at various scales, what is the impact of this global obsession, what we're calling lithiumphilia, this global obsession with Bolivia's lithium. What are the different impacts at the local level of this sort of massive obsession with these 21 million tons? So let me move now to some of the more kind of grounded material dimensions of mining. So mining in the brine. So what happens is just very quickly, the brine, if you're interested, what happens is that this highly saline solution, this brine, is pumped up into a set of industrial pools that are laid out in a grid fashion. And the pools are also connected through pipes. And what happens is as the H2O, the water in the brine, is evaporated just by its exposure to the elements, especially the sun, it becomes more and more concentrated. And as the brine becomes more and more concentrated, it gets pumped from one pool to the next until it gets down to the end of this process, until you have extremely highly concentrated solution. And eventually, as you see to the left, eventually all the H2O evaporates and you're left with these salt compounds. And the salt compounds are then taken into large industrial factories where the salt compounds then are put into a largely chemical process in which the salt compounds in which the objective is to remove all of the impurities with the goal of eventually obtaining a very high level of what they call battery grade lithium carbonate. And what you see over here actually is not primarily the lithium factory. It's actually a factory that's being used as a proof of concept for a new industrial lithium factory. In this factory to the right, they go through that same process, but instead of arriving at lithium carbonate to be sold on the global market, they're producing potassium chloride, which has a much lower level of purity and which is used primarily as fertilizer in regional markets in Brazil and Argentina. But the process is more or less the same. As you see here, again, maybe thinking about this in terms of other extractive processes, natural gas and mining, what happens is as the salt enters the factory, it then becomes, for most of the stages, a largely automated process in which you have workers who work for the state lithium company, YLB, monitoring the process to ensure that the salt is moving through the various chemicals that are applied to it. And then at the end, you have scientists who then use machinery like electron microscopes to analyze at a molecular atomic level the shape of crystals inside of the salt to ensure that that what eventually becomes the lithium carbonate has the right amount of purity. And so, where do I come in, or where do we come in as anthropologists? So what we're trying to do in a way is approach these broader political economies through the local level, through the granular materialities as we can approach them. Something we've been talking about is thinking through brine. What does it mean to understand lithium extraction and its connection with the so-called green energy transition through the very specific granular materialities that themselves constitute lithium industrialization in Bolivia? And I use this as an example just to show one of the dimensions of this granular materiality. So here I was being taken out by the head geologist at the plant in this part of the southern Salar. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to show me just how difficult, just how complicated the materialities were, the kind of challenges that they were facing in order to realize the state project. And so we went out and we got down on our knees, not here, but just in a bit. We got down on our knees. And what he wanted me to do was to put my finger into small holes. And he found these two holes in the salar. And he put his finger here, and then he put his finger here. And so he had me do it. And when I put my finger in one hole, these were about this close. The brine was ice cold. And then I put my finger right next to it, and it was almost scalding hot. It almost burned my finger. And the point he made was just within this short distance, what that indicates is underneath the salar, you have these extremely complicated, almost fractal hydrological and geological worlds that then bring the brine up, which are not connected. So his point was, in order to sort of figure out where the brine is, how to extract the brine with the best concentration, we have to figure out how to account for that hydrological and geological fractality, which just is demonstrated in this one small area, but which characterizes the subsurface area of this salar the size of Qatar. Right. So that again is a bit about the material complexities that we're analyzing and thinking through. So now let me move to the second to last part of this short presentation, which has to do with these local projects of auto development, which themselves are being organized around visions of potentiality, which are taking place in what I'm calling the penumbra of lithium industrialization. In other words, they're taking place in ways that are in the shadow of the lithium process on the salar, and which are not actively opposed to it. And I'll end with other productive potentialities which are arguably opposed in one way or another to the project. So here, this is just the sign, the entrance to a village in the most important province called Morlipes. This village is the capital of the province and plays an important role politically. It's called Colchaca, and as you can see, they are announcing themselves as the capital of Bolivia lithium. Now, what's interesting here is that this municipal center actually has very little to do with the lithium project. And just recently in my research, I said, this is a grand claim that you're making, that you're the capital of Bolivia lithium. Can you explain a little bit more about how you're participating? And in fact, the response was, this is really just a symbolic positioning, so that if and when some future benefits were to realize themselves that are coming from the state project that is oriented toward the state and not so much the local region, that they will have already symbolically, discursively positioned themselves as the capital of Bolivia lithium, until such time as those benefits that are really ambiguous will come into focus. So I thought this is interesting because it kind of shows the symbolic discursive dimensions at the local level, which are relevant, but which really wouldn't be your first if you were if you would sort of think about just the lithium project itself on the Solar would be a bit hidden. And then a second kind of penumbral project of auto development is much more well developed. And this is and some of you might have even been to the Solar de Uyuni, this is the massive tourism industry, which takes place on the surface of the Solar, and which basically revolves around taking tourists who arrive in Uyuni, taking them on tours for 1, 2, 3 days on the Solar, where the guides are specialists in staging Dali-esque surreal photos using the unique geology and perspective or lack of perspective on the Solar, so that people can have brilliant photographs for their Instagram feeds. And this whole industry is sort of also integrated into its own kind of global economy that involves Expedia and the different rating sites, and that the agencies and the guides are very, even for example, some guides who are rated as being particularly good in staging these photographs, and who then, as David was telling us, because David has been on the Solar and has his own photograph, which I'm sorry I don't have that image, a nighttime photo in which the long exposure is being used. And so the guides are constantly trying to innovate and come up with new categories of images that will then make their guide company or their guiding services more valuable. But the point is that this is taking place overlapping on the same surface as the lithium project, and in ways which are not necessarily opposed to it, in part because the lithium project is not yet fully realized. The industrial facilities are still being built. So they're wary of how this might impact their business, because it is all taking place in the same southern part of the Solar, but they see themselves as sort of complementary with the project. And even more importantly, when I ask the guides how they see themselves as environmentalists or their activities, they say that unlike the state lithium project, which is obviously like mining and extracting resources, we are the true guardians of the environment. We don't leave anything, we don't take anything. And then I ask them, well, what are you producing? And they tell me that we're producing life-changing experiences for people around the world in a way that's part of what they see as a circular economy. So there's actually kind of sort of a little bit of a tension between how they see their own project and the state company. And then just to conclude very quickly, the last category of our project, or this what I'm going to talk about now, are what I would call competing visions. In other words, competing projects, competing local productive economies, which are opposed to the state lithium project in one way or another, or at the very most parallel to. And here, this is an amazing discovery, I guess, of the project, which is the fact that 60 kilometers from the lithium facilities, there is a small town called San Cristobal. This is not the town, by the way. This is a painting of the older town of San Cristobal, which was then completely destroyed in order to build this. So this is the mine of San Cristobal, which is one of the world's largest open pit silver mines. And the village was destroyed. Part of the village was then moved 19 kilometers away in order to create this project. This project has nothing to do with the state government. It's owned by Sumitomo, which is a Sogo Shosha, which is a particular kind of Japanese transnational post-World War II multi-diversified company. I thought I'd mention that since I'm here at the University of San Paulo. If there's anybody here interested in the business dimensions of this project. And the new village, the new town of San Cristobal, was relocated. And in the village of San Cristobal, which again is just right in the same province as Nordipes, which is the same province which abuts the Salar, you have, over the last 20 years, since the mine was opened in the late 1990s, you've had some of the highest salaries per capita, the largest amount of wealth per capita is found in this small village. This is just a house, a kind of mansion that's being built by a local resident in the village, based on a combination of high mining salaries and the royalties from San Cristobal mine, which are distributed annually, again, for the last over 20 years. For example, because this village, this town of about 2,000 people is absolutely awash in resources, which they themselves admit. In interviews, I mean, it's not something you often hear in rural Bolivia, where villagers complain about having too many resources. They just don't know what to do with it. It's a common refrain. So what they do is they build things. So here is a market, a new market, basically a shopping center that was built. And the problem is it's largely empty because there's no demand for such a large shopping center in this part of southwestern Bolivia. And this is also a magnificent building, which is the new library, this was from January 2023. So this, again, you have this town, San Cristobal, and the people in San Cristobal are, unlike Colchaca, they're not so interested in the potential benefits from the lithium project. If at some point in the future there might be royalties from the sale of lithium carbonate in the global market, which get distributed at the national level and at the department level, and eventually work their way down to San Cristobal, that they're not opposed to that. But they're largely what they're largely concerned with is maintaining this relationship, which, and this brings me to Marika's work, who's written about these what she calls economies of obligation in Bolivia, this notion of relational patronage as wealth. And in a way, that analysis fits perfectly with the political economy, this local political economy, which is again kind of opposed to the national lithium project, which can't really be analyzed as an example of an economy of obligation. It's oriented around a different kind of economy, different kind of logics. So I think that's what that was my sort of introduction to my project. And I think at this point we were planning to have a joint reflection on the methodological implications of our two presentations.